StrayAllDay.com.
Now tuned into the show where you learn the discipline to show up day after day to do the work, the confidence to put yourself out there boldly and authentically, and the mental toughness to continue showing up, doing the work, putting yourself out there, even when the success you've expected to achieve is yet to be achieved. And on top of all this, get a huge dose of personal initiative, which is the go-getter energy that moves anyone out there, including yourself, actually, especially yourself. It's going to make things happen instead of waiting for things to happen. We put all this together into one framework, one codified process. We create a whole philosophy, brand, lifestyle around this, wrote a book on the subject. We have a university, and you're listening to the daily masterclass that is called Work on Your Game. My name is Dre Baldwin, also known as Dre All Day, and welcome to the show. And today's topic, embracing your disagreeableness. Yes, you heard me correctly. Disagreeableness, embracing this aspect of life, embracing this aspect of who you are as a person. And it's interesting that this topic happens to come up at this time, because just recently in an open Q&A event that we had in Work on Your Game University, I had a couple gentlemen ask me about this from different angles. One person was asking about, well, what about when you're going after something in life and the people around you don't quite understand it, or they don't quite get it, they don't quite see the same thing that you see? How do you get them to understand it? And another question someone asked was, well, as a male, and sometimes I feel, because a gentleman was saying, sometimes I feel that people might be underestimating me or looking at me a certain way because of whatever they may be perceiving about me. And he was asking about, is this being toxic? Is this being toxic masculinity? Is this toxic masculinity? And what can I do about it? Or how do I fix it? Do I need to adjust myself? And part of my answer to both of those questions, my answer went a little bit further than what I'm going to give you here. And you can watch the replay if you're a member of the university. You can see the replay in the university members area. But part of the answer to both of those questions is not so much that you need to adjust yourself to fit what other people want or what you think you might be doing wrong with regards to other people. Because in some aspects of life, actually many aspects of life, you don't need to adjust yourself or shape yourself in a certain way to agree with everybody else or to compromise or to get along. Sometimes in life, you will disagree with the status quo. You will not be on the same page as everyone else. People will not see things the same way as how you see them. And you know what? That's exactly the way that it should be, because that's where we get different things from. That's where we get creativity from. That's where change comes from, is people who embrace the fact that they don't necessarily agree with what everybody else has going on. So there's a website called Very Well Mind. When I was looking up this whole concept of disagreeableness, and I'll also tell you where it initially came from even before that. But first, let me give you the definition that this website called Very Well Mind gives of disagreeableness. Quote, this personality dimension includes attributes such as trust, altruism, kindness, affection, and other pro-social behaviors. People who are high in agreeableness tend to be more cooperative, while those low in this trait tend to be more competitive and sometimes even manipulative. Now, I'm going on their website right now, and I'm going to pull up where they talked about specifically agreeableness versus disagreeableness, because it came from this very concept called the Big 5 personality traits. And I had never really heard of this. I wasn't aware that there was a Big 5 of personality traits, but I was listening to a different podcast that I'll tell you about in a minute that was actually on my list of favorite podcasts that I like to listen to. And there was a guest on there who mentioned this. It got me to looking at it. And then when I saw it, I said, you know what, this is a topic that I need to talk about. And then, as serendipity has it, a couple people actually asked me questions that related directly to this thing. So it's perfect timing all the way around. So anyway, as I just read the definition that Very Well Mind gives of agreeableness, let me read off to you a couple of they have 5 points that they would use to describe people who are either high or low in this concept of agreeableness. And before I even read into this, first of all, let me make sure I'm being very clear with you that neither one of these is right or wrong. So if you as a human being, there are 5 aspects, the 5 big personality traits are openness. I can't even remember what they all are. I thought I was going to remember. It's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So when it comes to, for any one of those 5, and you can look these up and read about them yourself, there are many websites that talk about them. None of these if you're high, you're doing good, and if you're low, you're doing bad, because we all have a different mix. And if everyone was exactly the same, or even striving to be exactly the same, then we would all be robots, and there'd be no need for this show or anything that any of us is doing, because we all be exactly the same. We all be automatons. So anyway, as I read off, first I'm going to read off the 5 traits of someone who is high in agreeableness. These are the things that they would use to describe you. 1, has a great deal of interest in other people. 2, cares about others. 3, feels empathy and concern for other people. 4, enjoys helping and contributing to the happiness of other people. 5, assists others who are in need of help. Those are people who are high in agreeableness. Now, when they describe people who are low in agreeableness, in other words, disagreeable, here are the way they describe them. 1, takes little interest in others. 2, doesn't care about how other people feel. 3, has little interest in other people's problems. 4, insults and belittles others. 5, manipulates others to get what they want. So those are the ways that they would describe someone who is low in agreeableness. In other words, disagreeable. Now, where did all of this idea, where was the seed planted in my mind? I'll tell you. I was listening to Bill Simmons' podcast. He has a separate podcast called The Book of Basketball, where he is, at least in this season when I was listening to it, he takes some players that he was really fascinated by, and he does a deep dive on that specific player. He brings on a guest, and Bill and his guests, they just go deep talking about this individual player. Now, he was, in one of these episodes, he was talking about a guy by the name of Rick Barry. Now, many of you may be too young to even remember Rick Barry. You might not even know who Rick Barry is, but he is a legendary player, Hall of Fame player, one of the greatest players of all time. He played back in the 70s. I didn't see Rick Barry play. I couldn't tell you what Rick Barry looked like on a basketball court, but I had heard of him. I had an idea who he was. Rick Barry actually shot free throws underhanded, and he was a really great free throw shooter. There's a little nugget of information you can get about Rick. But Rick Barry was also known, despite the fact of how great of a basketball player he was known for being kind of a dick, kind of an asshole to his teammates, even though he was playing a team sport called basketball. And Bill Simmons' guest for this particular episode discussing Rick Barry was one Malcolm Gladwell. Now, Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast of his own called Revisionist History. And as a matter of fact, he has seasons for his show, so he doesn't always, he's not consistently publishing. So I didn't even consider it when I was looking into my podcast that I listen to. But when that show is actually publishing consistently, that is a show that I listen to all the time. So that's a bonus episode that I would have put in had I been thinking about it, but he hadn't been publishing, so I didn't always put it in my list. But anyway, Bill Simmons brings Malcolm Gladwell on to talk about Rick Barry. And Malcolm Gladwell obviously is a basketball fan because he's brought Malcolm Gladwell on many times to talk about sports. Gladwell's a sports fan. I think Malcolm Gladwell was a runner. I think that's what he did. He ran. And I've seen Malcolm Gladwell, his physical stature, I believe running was his thing. He's a Canadian guy. Many of you probably have an idea who Gladwell is. He wrote the books Blink. He wrote the book The Tipping Point, What the Dog Sell, David versus Goliath. Anyway, you can look him up on your own time. But anyway, one of the things that Gladwell was saying about Rick Barry when they started to discuss him was that Gladwell brought up these 5 human personality traits. So he's the one who actually brought it up and brought it to my attention. And he said basketball players generally are very high they're very creative because you're an artist when you're playing a sport and doing something like that. But also anyone who plays a team sport is very high in agreeableness. You have to be very high in agreeableness because you got to deal with all these other players, all these other personalities. Sometimes you have to play a role. We've done master classes talking about that. You don't always get your way. Sometimes you have to bend to the will of the group and not just what you want yourself. And the thing is, a person like Rick Barry, who is not high in agreeableness, he's actually very high in disagreeableness. It's ironic that he became a great basketball player because he's in this sport where agreeableness is usually a trait that you need, but he ended up being great without it. And it got me to thinking, and then Gladwell went on to talk about how people who become entrepreneurs, a person like Steve Jobs, who any of you who knows anything about Steve Jobs was he was very well known for being an asshole. He was very well known for being very disagreeable, making his employees cry and just being very non-empathetic. Whatever the opposite of being empathetic is, that's what Steve Jobs was. And he was that type of person. He did not really care about other people's feelings. He didn't really care about what was going on in other people's lives. And he became, and I mean, we know who he is. He's been dead for a decade, but we all know who he is because of the great things that he created. And it was that disagreeableness that allowed him to do that. The fact that he disagreed with what the world was presenting and he wanted to do something different, he was able to revolutionize what we do in technology and look at what we have now and look at the devices that you're holding in your hands or have in your pocket right now because of that very disagreeableness. You think of somebody like Michael Jordan. When I was reading those 5 traits of disagreeableness, people who are low in agreeableness, i.e. Disagreeable. I think in the book Relentless, written by Tim Grover, who was Michael Jordan's trainer, that whole book is basically a whole book about the concept of being disagreeable. He doesn't actually ever cite that in the book, but that's what the whole book is about. Tim Grover has chapters in the book where he talks about the very thing. You don't care about what's going on in other people's lives. You have people around you because they help you get to where you want to get to. And if they can't help you get to where you want to get to, then you discard them. You don't need friends. Your friends need you. You don't care about what's going on with other people. You're too focused on your own business and where you want to go as a person. And there are people who loved that book. I mean, there are business mastermind groups that I'm in. I'll give you an example. Business mastermind groups that I'm in where these guys, and they all seem to fit a similar profile. And you can figure why this is. I don't know why it is, but it is that these guys are somewhere between the ages of 30 and 60, white guys, businessmen, not athletes, but businessmen. And they just swear by this book. This book is like their fucking Bible. This book by Tim Grover, Relentless. And this book is all about the very concept of being a disagreeable individual, non-empathetic, don't care about other people, using other people for your own purposes, manipulating them if you have to, doing whatever you have to do to win at all costs. That's what it's all about. And Michael Jordan, and this whole book was basically Michael Jordan's mentality. Michael Jordan was and the thing about Mike was that as a basketball player, if you watch the Last Dance documentary that came out on ESPN in the spring of 2020, and you have watched any of the stories about Jordan or read stories about Michael Jordan, you know, or any of the books written about Michael Jordan, you know that away from the cameras, when nobody was watching, Michael was a pretty disagreeable guy. He was an asshole to his teammates. He would challenge his teammates. He would ride his teammates. He would just emotionally try to destroy his teammates. And he called it. He said, Michael Jordan said, well, I was doing that to test them, to make them stronger, to make them better. But a lot of people look at that and say, all right, Mike was kind of an asshole. He was kind of like Steve Jobs, but just the basketball version. And Mike, at the same time, just like Steve, he created this great thing and he has this great legacy because on camera, as I don't know so much about Steve Jobs, but Michael Jordan on camera, he was great. Like, he was this affable person. He was this empathetic person. He was this nice guy. He had the $1 million smile. He did all his endorsements and advertisements. So he was able to strike the balance. But the whole point is this. Disagreeable individuals a lot of times are the ones who create new things, bring new stuff to the world. It's because of their disagreeableness that they don't value compromising, empathy, friendship, and getting along with everyone else. And then I got to thinking about myself when I heard Malcolm Gladwell talking about Rick Barry, how Rick Barry would have been much better doing an individual sport like tennis or golf or swimming, where you don't have to deal with teammates and it's all just about you. And I often have thought to myself, before I even heard Malcolm Gladwell say this, is that, you know what, I probably would have been, as far as mentally, I don't know about my physical attributes because I never really got serious about any sport that was individual. I never really played tennis. I have never played golf. I've been to the driving range, but the ball doesn't go very far. But I would love to be able to do that, maybe one day. And I don't know what other individual, boxing maybe. I never got into any of those sports, never had any serious training in any of those sports. And I thought, I would always think to myself, I would have been really good in the individual sport simply because I didn't have to deal with other people. I just had to deal with me. Now, I might deal with, of course, my trainers and the opponents, but the whole thing was based on me as an individual person. And that's just the way my mind has always been. That's why I became an entrepreneur. That's why, I mean, look at what you're listening to right now. I have a show. Most people who have shows, they have guests on the show, so they can talk to the guests and go back and forth with them. I got a show, damn near 2,000 episodes, just me talking. This is just how I am. It's just part of my wiring as a human being. And when I think about what I did in team sports, as far as playing a sport like basketball, how was I able to reach a certain level of achievement in that sport, despite the fact that I think I would have been much better playing an individual sport? The reason is, when things weren't working the way that I wanted them to work in that team sport, it was my level of disagreeableness with the situation of not making it in high school and having to walk on in college, and then the situation not working out in college, and then having to try to hustle my way into the pros. The fact that I had those roadblocks in front of me, and the fact that I disagreed with them was the very thing that pushed me to make it happen. And because I was disagreeing with the situation, that's what actually moved me to make it happen anyway, just to prove, again, not to any individual person, but to the situation, that you couldn't stop me from getting to the outcome that I wanted, even though I was kind of going against the grain of my personal nature of being much more individualistic than being a team player. So it was a fascinating epiphany that I had when I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell and Bill Simmons. So now, all that being said, we're still in the introduction here. Let's talk about you embracing your disagreeableness in life. Point number one. Society values and promotes agreeableness. I think we all understand this, especially the further we get into the world that we're in right now. I mean, I grew up in an era way before social media, before we had online presence. Each of us had an online presence where it was okay for there to be conflict, open conflict that led to verbal and sometimes even physical altercation. It was just a normal thing. We accepted it. It's not like we were looking for it, and some people were looking for it, actually, to be honest, but we accepted it. Nowadays, it's much more collaborative. It's much more everybody be cool. It's much more everybody's friendly. Everybody's getting along, being cool and friendly, going along with the group. And one of my challenges to that is, because there's a lot of good things that can come from that, but here's the first thing that I think when I think about things being that way. This is where group think comes from. Group think is when everybody in the group is, because there's a group of people, it could be 5 people, it could be 500 people, and an idea gets pushed forward and a couple people support it. Now, because of the power of the group, all having that idea, or apparently all having that idea, it's not really all, nobody in the group wants to stand out from the group and say, hey, maybe this is not the best idea. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we should do something else. Here's some holes that I want to poke in the concept that we're going to push forward. Nobody wants to do that because the power of the group kind of intimidates people from speaking up and saying, well, let's do something different. Nobody's willing to stick out from quote unquote everyone else. And what happens is you get suboptimal results because a group, a committee, doesn't make as good of a decision as one individual person makes. A committee of 10 people is not going to make as good of a decision as each one of those 10 people individually would make if they knew that they got to really think and come up with what they would come up with on their own, and then come together, compare notes, argue about their notes, go back and forth, debate, and then come out with the best thing. That's really what would work. And you can do that in a group if everybody is willing and is encouraged to disagree with what everybody else says. And a book that talks about this, specifically what I just described, is Good to Great by Jim Collins. He talks about this in the book, how companies that become great, their staffs, they get together, they have their meetings, and they say, all right, we need to discuss this. How are we going to figure this out? And then one person throws something out and somebody else throws something out, and they go back and forth. They fight tooth and nail and argue over these things and go back and forth. A ton of disagreement. And then they finally settle on what is the best outcome, not because anyone is intimidated from offering a disagreement, not because anyone's intimidated from offering a counterpoint. It's actually because they're encouraged to do it and they're all willing to do it. It's part of their makeup to do so and is encouraged in that group. That's how they come out with great results. And that's how those companies become great, because everyone is encouraged to disagree, not because they're encouraged to agree. And this is also why in life people become followers. Because you want to be accepted, you want to be part of a group. There's safety in those numbers. You don't want to stand out. And a lot of people are definitely afraid of standing out. They're definitely afraid of saying something that not everybody else is saying, and knowing that they may be attacked by the group, by the sheep in those follower groups, because they don't have the same opinions. Even though your best opportunities in life are usually in standing out and doing something other than what everybody else is doing. Because if there was really an opportunity in doing what everybody else is doing, well, the opportunity is already gone because everybody else already snatched it all up before you even got to the table. Moving on to point number 2. Today's topic, once again, is embracing your disagreeableness. Change occurs in life only when someone disagrees with the status quo and is willing to stand up and stand out in going against it. If you think about it, Michael Jordan, one of the things that he disagreed with was athletes being marketed as just generic thing. It wasn't just Michael Jordan. There was some people who had the idea of how they would use Michael Jordan as far as marketing. Let's not make the athletes so generic and put them all in the same sneaker and just change the colors. Let's build a whole marketing campaign around one individual person and really make it about this individual. Michael Jordan started that. I talked about that in episode 1217, the Virtual Mentors episode number 5, about Michael Jordan, which I suggest you listen to. One of my favorite episodes actually of this show. And that change, now look what we have now. Every single athlete, even those who have not even 1% of Michael Jordan's accomplishments, now their whole marketing campaigns are built around them. Nowadays, we got people who aren't even known, haven't accomplished much, building marketing campaigns about themselves just for a market, just for the purpose of doing it. Famous for being famous, as we have nowadays. Michael Jordan was one of the first seeds being planted for that. And the status quo can only change when somebody's willing to stand up and go against it. All the great change agents that we know about. Martin Luther King, did he disagree what was going on? Absolutely he did. Now, were there other people who disagreed? Maybe. But Martin Luther King was the one who became the face of that disagreement because he was willing to keep taking it as far as it needed to go, and he was willing to risk life and limb in the possibility in the process of doing that. In the process of disagreeing, he was willing to risk his life and pay for it with his life. LeBron James, did he disagree? Yes, he did. LeBron James disagreed by going from high school to the league. Now, he wasn't the first one to do it. There were a handful who did it before him, but he disagreed in a way that I've talked about when I talked about building your teams in life, and that he fired the traditional business people that he had around him in the early years of his career, and he put his own friends on, his own associates. He put them on to be the people running his business. And a lot of people said, well, that's a bad idea. You're putting your friends on to run your business. They don't know anything about business. They don't have experience. They don't have the same seasoning as these traditional professionals that you had working around you. LeBron's making a mistake. Even though he's great on the basketball court, he's proven that part, he's going to mess up things off the court because he's putting on people who don't have the same level of seasoning and experience. Well, we can see that ended up being a wrong assessment. And LeBron James, it appears the people that he put on are doing a pretty good job of running LeBron James Incorporated. Paris Hilton was the one who actually started this whole ecosystem that we have, for lack of a better term, of taking selfies and building a brand and business around just focusing on yourself. Just pay attention to me. Hey, everybody look at me. The selfie, the famous for being famous, famous for doing nothing person. A lot of people think that started with Kim Kardashian. No, it started with Paris Hilton, but Kim Kardashian was Paris Hilton's personal assistant. A lot of people don't know that. It started with Paris, but she disagreed, and now look what we have now. Now all of us are doing it. Now all of us are taking selfies and talking to a camera and posting pictures of ourselves and wanting the world to like it because of that. She started that. All of those people that I just mentioned, and there are many others, did something that was not widely accepted at the time, took a ton of criticism for doing it at the time, but now we see everybody else is following their formula. Interesting, right? So many times you had to take, and Russell Brunson, who's the host of the Marketing Secret Show, which again, in my podcast, I listened to episodes, I talked about Russell. He talked about how people who are pioneers of what they do, you know they're a pioneer because they usually have a whole bunch of arrows sticking out of their back. In other words, because they were the first one to do it, everyone took shots at them. Everyone took aim at them. Everyone had something negative to throw at them because they were disagreeing with the status quo, going against the grain, doing something different. But because they took all those arrows in their back, they cleared the path for everyone else to be able to go and do the exact same thing. Did Martin Luther King clear the path for social justice that we have nowadays? Absolutely he did. Did LeBron James clear the path for someone getting on because of their abilities and their performance and their talent, and then being able to put their friends in position to succeed at the same time? Yes, he did. Now, he wasn't the first ever to do it, but did he clear that path, and is he recognized as one of the people who made that a trend? Absolutely he was. Did Paris Hilton clear the path for all of us to take selfies and build a brand and even a business around just talking about ourselves, even if we may not even be that talented in any one individual thing? Yes, she absolutely did. So this is what I mean when I say that disagreeableness, that change comes from people who are willing to disagree. That change comes from the people who are willing to take the arrows in their back, who are willing to take the hit for everybody else so then they can move forward. I'll tell you another story. There's this guy by the name of Paul Nicklin, who's a photographer, and I believe he works for National Geographic, or maybe he's independent, but he's one of the few people that I follow on Instagram that I do not know personally. And he had this picture. He takes these amazing pictures, like in the Arctic. His photography is based on the Arctic and saving the animals in those areas where the ice is melting and things like that. And he has posts where he shows like polar bears and penguins and seals and things like that. So there's this great photo that he had this one time, and he puts a story in the caption of the photo. And there's a bunch of penguins standing on the edge of some ice, and they're about to jump off the edge of the ice and dive into the water so they can swim to wherever they got to go. Now, while the penguins are standing on the edge, you can see them peering over the edge into the water, and there's this big ass seal swimming in the water right underneath the cliff. Now, seals, if you don't know, seals hunt and eat penguins. So the penguins are standing on the edge looking because they know as soon as they jump in, they may become a meal for this seal. And Paul Nicklin tells a story and says, he says, all right, the penguins are looking over and you see this big ass seal just sitting there in the water waiting so he can get his meal of eating these penguins. And Nicklin explains that the seals, knowing this, that usually the one who dives in first is basically knowing that they are sacrificing themselves because the seal is going to get them and try to kill them and eat them. They're sacrificing themselves so that all the rest of the penguins can swim to the other side and get home safely and get back to their young. So it's just a matter of who's going to be the one that's willing to sacrifice themselves for everybody else. And I'm telling you that story to go along with the point that I just made, is that these change agents, the people who actually start this change and take a whole bunch of arrows in their back, they're like the penguins sacrificing themselves for the seal so then everybody else can be safe on the back end. Entrepreneurs are usually people who are high in disagreeability. They don't disagree with what's already going on, so they say, I'm going to create something new. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to bring something to the table that is not already here. This is why entrepreneurs do their own things and create change. Entrepreneurs are not usually that great, at least at the beginning, team players. They're usually people who say, I am going to do something different. Then they can bring a team around them later on. Solo sport athletes also. This is why solo sport athletes are people who walk alone, people who start movements, all highly disagreeable individuals, and these are the people who create change. Followers do not create change, people. Followers can follow someone who is creating change, but the people who decide to walk alone and then they generate followers, those are the ones who create change. Point number 3. Today's topic, once again, is embracing your disagreeability. Number 3, there is immense value in agreeableness. Okay, so I'm not telling you that if you happen to be an agreeable person that there's something wrong with you or you're doing something incorrect or that what we're talking about here can't possibly be for you. There is value in agreeableness because people who are disagreeable need agreeable people around them to help support them. Support staff, for example. These are highly agreeable persons. So when you walk into a place of business and there's a person at the front desk who greets you warmly and with a smile and is very helpful and accommodating and wants to help you get whatever you came there for, that's a very agreeable type of person. If you are a disagreeable person running some type of enterprise or creating something new, you want as many people like that on your team as possible because they help you, support you, so you can do what you need to do. And they can be the buffer between you and the people that you don't even want to have to talk to. Team players, if you play a sport, role players on your team, they may be capable of doing a whole lot of things, but you ask them to do only half of what they're capable of doing, and they're willing to accept that role. You need role players on the team because everybody can't be a superstar. First followers are the type of people, again, when someone starts a movement, they decide to walk alone, and somebody says, you know what, I like what you're doing, I'm going to follow you in what you're doing and support you. That first follower makes it cool for the second follower and the third follower and the 30th follower to go follow along, and now that's when the movement begins. A movement can't be just one person. A movement has to be one person starts it, but then other people decide, you know what, I'm going to get involved in that too. I like what this person has going on. They make it cool to go with the movement. And they are not only valuable, but they are necessary for disagreeable people. Because a disagreeable person who doesn't have any followers, well, who knows how far you're actually going to get. That allows you to forge that new path. So there's nothing wrong with being an agreeable type of person. And we all have a bit of both of these in us, whether the agreeable side or the disagreeable side. But regarding today's discussion, disagreeing is what you tap into when you're in a situation that you want to shake things up, make change, disturb the status quo. Right? Life and society often encourage and reward agreeableness, and we make a story about people who are agreeable, but we only make stories about the disagreeable people in posterity. Only later on, when we see that their disagreeability actually ended up as something great, then we give them credit later on. We give them their flowers when they're too dead to smell them anymore. We say, oh yeah, you know what, they had it right. I'll give you an example. When the social justice movement, or whatever we want to call that, popped off in the summer of 2020, a bunch of people and athletes, the people in the sports world, started saying, oh yeah, you know what? Colin Kaepernick, he was right. All right, Cap was right. He was right all along. We're all going to kneel before the games now. When the fact is, when he first started doing it in 2016, very few people were willing to vocally support that man. No organizations, no big organizations were vocally supporting that man. A bunch of people were either going against him, or the people who claimed that they supported him all along were too scared and too pussy to say out loud they supported him because they saw what happened to him and they didn't want the same thing to happen to them. But now, when it became clear that, again, in the eyes of the people who were saying it, that, okay, well, see, he had the right idea all along, then all of a sudden everybody wanted to give him his flowers. The problem was he had already lost his career. He had already lost his sports career after, 5 years later, 4 or 5 years later. Now he's lost his sports career. Now all of a sudden everybody wanted to give him his flowers. That's what happens when you're the pioneer. You take all the arrows in your back, and people are telling you that you're wrong, and the people who even support you are too afraid to support you publicly because they don't want to have the same thing happen to them to happen to you. But then when it becomes cool and it becomes, I guess if you want to call it proven in the eyes of whoever, relatively speaking, that you were right, now all of a sudden everybody wants to support you. Now all of a sudden everyone wants to give you your flowers when the opportunities are gone. Another example, Elon Musk has a company called Tesla. People know who Nikola Tesla was. Tesla was a Serbian scientist, I guess we'll call him, and he was compared a lot of times in that time to Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison is way, way more famous than Nikola Tesla. And very few people were even talking about Tesla, at least in the general public, until Musk came out with his company and called it Tesla, start calling his cars after Nikola Tesla. But Tesla was a genius scientist. He had some ideas that were even better than Thomas Edison's, but the fact is, because of his disagreeableness and the fact that he wasn't as agreeable as a Thomas Edison, he didn't have the same relationships as Thomas Edison, he wasn't as political as Thomas Edison, Tesla took all those arrows in his back. And nowadays, in 2021, he's getting all these flowers, but the guy's been dead for years. This is what happens when you're a disagreeable person. Sometimes when you're disagreeable and you start a brand new thing. So understand, if you're going to embrace your disagreeableness, that this may be your fate. This may be the way things work out. And maybe you'll still be alive, but it's going to be way after the fact when you actually get credit for the thing that you created. You look at someone like Paris Hilton, who's not even, who knows, maybe even 40 years old. And she's getting credit now for being the one who started this whole culture that we all have embraced and we're all living in right now. But at the time when she started it, she was getting a lot of backlash. She was getting a lot of negative energy from people because of that. Again, Colin Kaepernick, he got a lot of negative energy at the time that he was taking that knee, and the people who supported were quiet. Nowadays, everybody wants to support him. Where were you all at in 2016? And this is something that I've asked that question many times with no real useful answers up to this point. That's a different discussion for a different day. Life and society encourage and reward agreeableness because life and society want to keep things as they are. Human beings like to maintain the status quo because there's no change and no discomfort in maintaining the status quo. But to make change, you got to go against the grain. And with that being said, this ain't for everybody. Let's recap today's class, which is how to embrace your disagreeableness from the Very Well Mind website. They say the personality dimension includes attributes such as trust, altruism, kindness, affection, and other pro-social behaviors. People who are high in agreeableness are more cooperative, while those low in this trait tend to be more competitive and even manipulative. So I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell, Bill Simmons talk about a guy named Rick Barry. He was a very disagreeable guy, noted by a lot of his teammates and colleagues as pretty much an asshole, even though he played a team sport and he was a great player. Got me thinking about myself and some questions that people have been asking me, which leads to these points. Number one, society values and promotes agreeableness, getting along, being cool, friendly, going along with the group. This is where groupthink is sourced from. Understand, nobody wants to stick out from everyone else when you're imbued with groupthink, and you get suboptimal results because of it. And this is why people become followers. There's safety in numbers. People are afraid of standing out, even though the best opportunities are in the opposites of standing out. Number two, change happens only when someone disagrees with the status quo and is willing to stand up and out against it. Martin Luther King, LeBron James, Paris Hilton, Colin Kaepernick, these people all started conversations and affected a lot of people, but a lot of them were not given credit at the time that they did it, even by their own supporters, because their supporters were afraid of taking the same arrows in their back that these pioneers were willing to take in their back, which is why, and the thing about being an entrepreneur or people who create change, these are people who are high in disagreeability. They see the status quo and they say, I disagree with this. I'm going to go out on a limb and show everybody that I disagree, and I'm going to take the heat for disagreeing, and I'm going to create change. And usually, again, you don't get credit for it until way after. You might not even be allowed to receive those flowers. And number three, there's immense value in agreeableness. Support staff, team players, role players, first followers. These people are needed by disagreeable people to forge a new path. So there's nothing wrong with being an agreeable individual, and we all have a little bit of both in us. But today's discussion is about disagreeing, and that's what you tap into. You want to shake things up, make change, and disturb the status quo. Life and society reward agreeableness, but that's because life and society are always pushing to maintain the status quo and punishing anyone who decides to go after it. But if you want to make change, you got to be willing to go against the grain. Work on your game. Dre all day.